Yeah, so I'm happy to be here for the Secret Life of Pawns. And the title, it seems a little silly, but one thing is, I do believe that different players have different relationships to their pawns. I think there's like an intuitive thing. Some people think they're about that they want to promote, and my pawns usually aren't that ambitious. My pawns usually are about controlling things, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The game we're going to talk about, we could have talked about a lot of different games, but I'm really interested, of course, in the match coming up with Fabi and Caruana, so I want to use one of their games that they played that I think is going to be a little bit typical for the struggle that's going to happen starting on the 9th. So let's dive into it, and let me show you how this game started. This is from the Olympiad in 2014, and Carlsen does something that it'll be one of my big questions for the match coming forward is, will he play things like this? And what I mean by that is, with a offbeat kind of line like this, the main move that Fabi would have been prepared for is Queen A5, right? And you guys have probably seen that move at some point in your chess career. And Queen D8 you might have seen too, but it's just kind of like not the thing that you're going to study or anything like that. And so what's going to happen here is Black is going to be down a little bit of time, and he's going to be down a little bit in space, but he's still going to have a very solid position, and Fabi is going to have to work very hard to beat him, especially with space. And we're going to talk a little bit more about space a little later. All right, let's get into this, and I'll show you the intended structure that Carlsen has for himself here. Knight f6, knight f3, bishop g4, h3, and now Carlsen just snips it. And this will help us understand what Black wants. Okay, so this is a good point to start thinking about the dynamics in the position. And while I'm talking, maybe just think about what you would do as white, because Fabi plays a move here which is very beautiful, and I would have never have played it. It's the kind of move that wouldn't have crossed my mind. But so let me just talk a little bit about the basics of the pawn structure and what we see happening. The first thing that I think is really important to see is that this pawn, I have to learn how to properly do this here. Oh, I didn't want to do that. This pawn here is dominating the knight on c3. And what I see a lot of, I wouldn't even say beginning level players, but even 2200 level players and above, a lot of times they won't realize how bad the knight is on c3. It looks like a developed piece. They're accustomed to kind of thinking it as a developed piece, but it's truly dominated by the pawn on c6. Okay, the next thing we should say is that what Black has given up, in addition to some time and space, is he's given up his light square bishop. And so that means that this guy, oh, I didn't mean to do that. This guy here is the potential champion of White's position. So you can imagine if the position opens, all the light squares will be dominated by that one bishop. So notice that the first thing that Magnus did is the pawn on c6 is a one on a light square, so it's meant to block the light square bishop. His next move is going to be pawn to e6. So that's going to be like a wall for the light square bishop. And you can see once that structure happens that Black will be incredibly solid, and he'll have a good bishop on f8. In fact, all of his pieces will be more or less good. Bishop c4. Now notice the pawn on d4 is hanging. Right? Okay. D5 is interesting. Also a pawn sacrifice. Right? Okay. It's funny, when you ask people what if they, about us in a certain position, if there's some nice move, people almost always suggest a sacrifice. It's like the natural thing. They think it's going to be a sacrifice. So let's just say the natural move here that I think many people would do is bishop e3. And it's not the most terrible move. But watch what Fabi does, because it's really beautiful. He says, all right, this knight on c3 isn't working, and I'm going to use him to guard the pawn on d4.
So he's going to castle queenside after the knight goes there?
I think it's still flexible where he's going to go. It's this funny thing where, of course, let's just say, why would no one think of this? Because you're blocking the bishop on f1. And in summary, just intuitively, most people feel like their knight is more powerful on c3 than e2, because on e2 it's just touching 6 squares, and on c3 it's touching 8. So the knight is going to e2, and then we're going to see later it has the dream of being useful on g3. Okay? So let's look at how this goes. Knight e2, the first really nice move by Fabi. e6, and now g4. Okay, so let's talk about it. Now the plan is becoming a little clearer. We can put the bishop on g2, and later we want to make the knight on f6 poor by playing a move like g5, gaining some space. And this is the other thing that I think is critical for the match coming up, where Carlsen is willing to play positions where he's a little bit worse, like he is here, but he's solid. And in order to beat Magnus in a position like this, you are going to have to really strangle his pieces for lots of moves, lots and lots of moves. And if you slip, then that's it.
That's what he's looking for.
Right. So I really like Fabi's play so far. Let's keep on going here. Queen d5, bishop g2, knight d7, queen g3, queen c4, queen b3. Takes, takes. All right, I went through that kind of quickly, but it was a natural development from what we had before. Well, does anybody have a sense? Actually, I'll tell you what. Let me play Magnus's move first, because it's very natural. Bishop d6. Well, does anyone have a sense of what they think is happening in this position?
White's going to get the center. D4's. I mean, c4 is pretty strong.
So you like c4 right now? Okay. What I want you guys to see is that at whatever level you're at, when you get to a position like this, what you should be thinking about doing is making your opponent's pieces bad and yours better. In a way, that's all it is. That's all they're doing here. And the only reason I think Magnus has a chance, or excuse me, Fabi has a chance at being a little better here, is because some of his white-black's pieces are funny looking. Okay? Let's take a look at what Fabi plays. It's a very committal move, c4. Now, in my own secret life of pawns, this move makes me very nervous, okay? Because what now is permanently happening is that this pawn is always going to be weak. There's no way for my pawn on c4 to go back to c3. And it really is, in a lot of ways now, like an isolated pawn. It's a completely different pawn structure than if white plays pawn c3. Right? On pawn c3, I'm going to be able to just always have that guy defended. And so it's a sacrifice. It's really a long-term sacrifice from white. And the idea is, I guess, simply to stop the knight, this guy, from coming to d5. Right? So the idea is simple. We are taking squares away from his pieces, in particular his knights. So think about the knight on d7. It's dominated by the pawn on d4. And the knight on f6, we're working at some point to play g5. Right? Okay. Now, one thing I'll say is that you get this structure, by the way, a lot of times in a Caro-Kann. Maybe I'll just show that quickly. c6, d4, d5. It's the same structure, right? And in the Carlsen as well, a lot of times you want to just trade off your light square bishop and then zero in on that d pawn. Okay, so when we come back here, there are risks involved now for white. The game has become riskier with c4. It's an ambitious move. Okay, let's do a couple more moves. a6, bishop e3. By the way, a6, excuse me, I didn't mean to castle. a6 because the rook on a1 is hitting a7, and black decides to castle this way, and we castle now. Now, I will say that having played positions like this, it's very hard and it takes a lot of energy. It feels like, oh man, it feels like a lot of energy when you're playing these, especially a strong opponent, and they're so solid like this. Rook he8, and now knight g3. And at this point, I think white has to be really happy, though, even though it's a hard road ahead. Very happy about the position. And we are looking, in my mind, we're looking to play g5 fairly soon. Let's take a look at how this goes. Let me just say this. A lot of players would be tempted as black to play moves like c5, or e5, right? It just feels, because it feels like you're liberating your position or something like that. But remember, that's like the main goal for white, is to get you to make one of those moves, because this man really wants those light squares. The pawns on e6 and c6 are the barrier for that bishop. But if that bishop ever got opened, then watch out. It's a real problem, right? So Magnus, very patient in this position. And one of the things that, black needs to understand if he's going to play this structure, that you can play with the pieces, but you can't really play with the pawns. Okay. Now, knight f8. This position I've studied quite a bit, just looking at it on my own. And I will say, I know for a fact that if I was playing white, I would now play g5 without thinking at all about it. Right? And Fabi doesn't play g5, so it's kind of an interesting question. Like, well, why didn't he do it? Yeah.
Is that why Magnus moved the knight
To f8?
F8, so that knight on F6 has a place to go?
I don't think so, no. Notice actually, this is a good point actually to think about Magnus's position. Given that you're not going to play e5 or c5, the knight on d7 is pretty miserable. So the knight needs to do something. And I think the dream that Magnus has here, and we're going to actually see it, is at some point the knight might come to g6, right? F4 from white here?
And from g6 to f4.
G6 to f4, that's right, yeah. So I spent a lot of time on this, and I think this is an interesting thing, because from this point on, it's kind of like Magnus kind of gets inside Fabi's head here. So imagine like this position. We're going to see Carlsen now outplays Fabi, and this is the kind of thing that worries me for the World Championship, this kind of position, because I too would want to win this position. That's why I would want to push, but it's really hard. And notice just how solid the black position is. I think, this is what I think, that the reason he didn't play g5 was that he was concerned about giving up this square. In particular, that the knight would come here and then go through e7 and then land on f5. Now, I think it's still debatable how big of a deal it is, and I would still do it. I would definitely still do it if I was black. But, let's say, for example, h4, knight e7, h5, and I think black is going to play this ugly looking move g6. And the idea is, okay, knight e4 looks really good. That once black, this is the thing I think Fabi's kind of afraid of. Once the knight lands on f5, you're never going to get it out. And this pawn, for example, if you take on d6, right? If you take on d6, that pawn will permanently be a worry for you. You will, and that's the point of this Scandinavian structure. You're just aiming for some kind of endgame where the pawn is the thing that you're going to get your counterplay from and sometimes win the game. So I still think he should have played g5. But yeah, this, I think, is why he didn't do it. So you see with pawns, right, they are there to control your opponent's pieces. And a metaphor that I like quite a bit is to imagine like a person's life, their career, right? And when you think about a career, it's like some situations in life are going to suit your skill set and others are not, right? And the same thing with the pawn structures. You go through these different pawn structures and sometimes it's good for a piece and sometimes it's not. So a very good practical rule that I tell everybody is anytime there's a change in pawn structure, that's when you should reevaluate who you think are the good pieces and the bad pieces. Because their roles a lot of times change just instantly with the pawn change. And what the psychological trick is, like if you've been thinking that a certain piece has been terrible for a long time or good for a long time, that you don't reevaluate what's going on once that pawn structure change happens. Okay, so here we go with Fabi's interesting plan, bishop f3. And what is the point? White wants to control g4. We don't want to play g5, so we don't give him the f5 square. And by doing so, by controlling g4, we are now intending to play h4, h5 to hopefully dominate the knight on f8. Right? So we're still playing for the domination of the knights, but now we're moving to dominate the knight on f8. Okay, so here we go. Knight g6, h4, and now we're going to get a pawn structure change. And the knight on e7, right, he's boldly saying, well, if you ever play g5, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to come at you over there if you do it. Okay. In this position, I would still play g5 if I was Fabi, but Fabi does come up with an amazing and interesting plan. Try to put yourself in his shoes for a second. You have a choice between g5, which like your average GM like me would play, or think about this other thought. The knight on g3 really wants glory. Right? So just put yourself in Fabi's shoes for a second and imagine the following plan. e4, e5, you get e5 for free because you tap the knight, right? And then you play knight e4. And then after knight e4, you go into d6. Looks really strong, right? Looks really strong. And this is a funny thing, because this is how Magnus will get you. That's a really interesting moment here. So the pawn structure, first of all, is totally changed after this bishop takes e3 thing, right? And what I want you guys to pay attention to is that the drawback of that plan, of e4, is Magnus immediately plays h6, and now the pawns are fixed. The white pawns are fixed on these light squares. Now, why is that a big deal? Because the bishop wants his pawns to be on dark squares, so for two reasons. One, so that the bishop can move around and is not blocked by his own pawns, and also so that the pawns on the dark squares control the dark squares and he controls the light squares. It's like bricks and mortar. You need both. You can't just have one. Okay, so here we go, though. e5, knight h7, knight e4. So one way of thinking about it's like Fabi has sacrificed this square on g5 for the ability to put the knight on d6, right? Another important thing I think about this is that Fabi is still also claiming that the knight on e7 is bad. And that's kind of, we're going to see the crux of the position. Because if black can then make that piece reasonable, then he might really be able to use these pawn weaknesses that white's created. Remember, this guy's a disaster now, right? Long term. This guy's weak, and black's structure continues to be incredibly solid. Notice that the pawn on f7 is going to be guarded nicely by the knight on g5, right? So it's a funny thing when we go back to a position like this. First of all, I can't claim I would even see that plan of e4, e5, knight e4, knight e6. But if I saw it, would my heart start racing and I thought I'd have something special? Probably, yeah. That looks cool. That looks really cool. So yeah, this is the level of subtlety that is going to be happening in the match, where a lot of times you get something and then it's not the Christmas present you thought you were going to open, right? Okay, so here we go. Rook f8. We get our beautiful knight check. King c7. So right now, when we start looking at it, the knight, he's not doing as much as we might have hoped him to do, right? It's unclear how we're going to get something effective happening. I liked your suggestion of b4, b5. If we could arrange something like that, then at least, you know, the bishop could help the knight. Because as it is, he's just all on his own over there. He's a very beautiful piece, no one's denying, right? But he's all on his own there on d6. Okay, so here we go. Bishop g2. We have to get out of the way of the knight that's coming to g5 anyway. Knight g5. Rook hf1. f6. All right. So now the first problem is raising its head, namely, if you allow us to take on e5, which seems hard to avoid, then black is going to have a weakness on e5 to talk to, right? Notice also the bishop on g2. It's a long-term plan that began from the opening. The bishop on g2 is running up against a wall here, right? Okay, so white improved his king. Magnus took. And then here's a very tricky thing. So again, playing with a space advantage is very difficult because a lot of times, like here, you make pawn weaknesses in order to control your opponent's pieces. And what happens is if they ever get out, they will be particularly angry pieces because they're going to be jumping all over the weaknesses that you created trying to hold them in. They literally are like the caged animals that got out, right? Once they get out. So let's look. Knight c8. Now the only way to make the knight proud is to play c5. But now what's the problem? All right. Knight e7 is interesting. Anything else? True. What else? Knight e7 to d5.
Oh.
Freedom has now been achieved. Freedom has now been achieved. And now we're going to see that in the next several moves, Fabi really tries to squirm, but it doesn't look good all of a sudden. So for example, let's look. b4, knight d5. This knight is now so strong, you better take the thing, right? I've got the b4 square to worry about. I've got the e3 square to worry about. I've got the f4 square to worry about. The thing is, all of a sudden, he's a monster. He's come in behind all the weaknesses that you've created. Okay, Now, I think when Fabi played b4, he had the following intention, which is at least an attempt at counterplay. He takes, c takes. Now, notice the problem right away is that once the bishop leaves, now the knight gets this square on f3, right? Okay, so b5 is the intention. Takes, takes, king c6, knight d6. Now, this part is not so hard, right? Knight f3. Now, Fabi's a good defender. Look at this, b4. Think for a moment, what is the problem with knight e5?
What?
The problem with knight takes e5. It's not necessarily the end of the world kind of problem. It's just a thing black would rather not face, I think. Yeah. Though things are falling, like the g4 pawn and stuff like that, right? Okay.
Rook to d3.
Everything you guys are saying about rook e1 and stuff, that's all correct. But there's a move here that Fabi wanted to do, and that's b5. And now king takes c5 has a problem.
Oh.
And b5 in itself is a huge bonus for my position, right? Because I make your king go back, and now I can do all kinds of counterplay things, maybe like rook e1, right? Yeah. Now, I still think black probably has the advantage here, but it's getting messy. It's getting more messy than he wanted it to be. So, very calm move, rook a8.
So he takes the a file.
He takes a file, basically forcing Fabi to play rook a1. Now we take it, and now we take e5. No counterplay.
And that king is naked.
Yeah. And not only that, but the poor knight on d6, like we're going to play b6 soon, and he's going to have a problem. He's going to be totally undermined. What's that? Rook e1. Let's try it out. I think rook e1 isn't bad. There's a number of moves. This one's kind of annoying. Right? Because if rook e6 and knight d4.
Oh.
That's a good question, though. I mean, you can see that. I'm sure Magnus saw that in advance. Mm-hmm. So he played rook a7, rook b8. Again, it's just like a very calm move, which is going to deny the counterplay. There's really not much that white can do. Yeah. So white went back to guard against things like knight f3, and now b6. Rook a7, takes, check, takes. Let's undermine again, right? What a bummer. I think Fabi is truly flailing at this point. Rook a7, king c6. Yeah, I think this actually happened, even though it's pretty gross. G5, there's nothing really happening, right? d4, knight e5, king d5, knight d7, d3. If you go to d2 or something, I'm going to check with the rook. So he goes king c1, and after takes, takes, king e4. Magnus isn't even bothering with the g5 pawn. He just knows that this is a winning position, right? Because I'm going to play things like king e3 coming soon. Okay, yeah. So there it is, the secret life of pawns. Let me just review a couple positions that I thought were kind of critical, right? For one, you can see, like, first of all, I think Fabi played a number of moves here that I really like. I love the move knight e2, very deep move, and you know, sometimes maybe like all of you, you despair at some point about chess. Like chess might seem unfair, and you know the kids are beating you down and whatever. But moves like this are like what keep bringing me back to the game, honestly, because it's a beautiful thing. There's always ways to find ideas. And one cool thing about playing stronger players, I'll say in my own experience, is, getting hit with a move like 92 and just having to figure it out in your own head. It's really difficult. Yeah. And then, we rolled into this pawn structure. And it's really fascinating because you can see what White's objectives are. Almost anyone can see it, but it's so hard to achieve, right? And there's so much resilience in the black position here. This move, well, I thought that was the shot. Now we're saying, I'm coming for you, Magnus. Here we go. One thing actually I'll say I really admire about Fabi is the kid he's not afraid. He's not afraid at all. And C4, very committal. It's the first, actually, let's call it the first incredibly committal pawn move, right? And E4, E5 is going to be the next one. A6. Then we go castles, simple. This is very useful for anyone playing any kind of structure like this. Do not move your pawns, especially the pawns on C6 and E6, right? Don't let the bishop out. All right, knight G3, knight F8, bishop F3. Again, I would have played G5. And let's look again at how this goes. Knight G6, H4. Bishop F4, H5, Bishop E3, Fe3, knight E7. Right? So while you're watching, we come in on the ninth. This is the kind of thing that we're going to get. We're going to get, I think, it would surprise me if we didn't get a lot of endgames. I think we are going to get a lot of endgames like this. And it's going to be moments like this where, when we look at it, I think we have to say that White's a little bit better. Nothing outrageous, but I think White's a little bit better. But once you see that plan of sticking the knight on D6, it looks great. Oh, it looks beautiful to me. That looks like a good plan. And so that's one of the things, we're going to be watching for during our broadcasts and stuff here and all around the world, right? Okay. Any questions?